Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today we'll discuss a very important topic, that is embolism. Before discussing the embolism, we need to know what is an embolus. Briefly speaking, embolus is a detached detached intravascular mass that may be solid, liquid or gas. And this detached mass, it is carried by bloodstream from its point of origin to some distant site. And when it is carried to the distant site, it can cause the tissue infarction and tissue damage, resulting in necrosis or the dysfunction of that specific tissue. Majority of the emboli or the embolus, they usually originate as the thrombus. Initially, there occurs some thrombus formation in some specific part of the blood vessel, and that thrombus, it becomes dislodged. It dislodged from its point of origin, and then it is carried to some distant site. For example, if we talk about the pulmonary embolism, it usually originates in the lower limb, from where it is dislodged from its primary site of origin and then carried to the pulmonary circulation, or it may even be carried to some other circulation, like it can go into the coronary circulation, it can go to the cerebral circulation. So this was about the definition of the embolus. Now moving to the embolism. When we talk about embolism, it has various types, and in the next slide you will see the various types of the embolism. So these are the types of the emboli which are being displayed on your screens. We usually classify them as pulmonary embolism, then there comes the systemic thromboembolism, air embolism, quite important, fat and marrow embolism, and in the last we have the amniotic fluid embolism. First of all, we'll discuss pulmonary embolism. Pulmonary embolism, it is by far the most common form of the embolism that arises from the deep venous thrombosis. This pulmonary embolism, it usually arises in the form of small fragments, small thrombi, which gets dislodged from the legs, and ultimately they are carried by large veins into the right side of the heart, and that right side, as you know, that is the right atrium. So this is a mechanism by which the pulmonary embolism it is caused. The initiating event is the deep venous thrombosis in the legs. Two important types of embolism, they are written here: saddle embolism and the paradoxical embolism. First, I'll tell you about the paradoxical embolism. Saddle embolism we'll discuss along with the next slide. When we say some embolus as paradoxical, it refers to an embolism that is carried from the venous side of the circulation towards the arterial side of the circulation. So how this embolus that is carried from the venous side of the circulation to the arterial side? It results from some defect in the atrial septum or the ventricular septum. When there is that defect, it results in the transfer of the embolus from one chamber, from the atrial chamber to the other side of the heart, resulting in the development of paradoxical embolism. So this is saddle embolism. What is a saddle embolism? It is usually asked in the OSPE. Saddle embolism is a large embolus that usually is seen at the bifurcation of the pulmonary trunk. So this is a V-shaped embolus. As you can see in this slide, a V-shaped embolus that is straddled at the bifurcation of the pulmonary arteries or the pulmonary circulation. So this is quite important. This picture, it is usually present in the OSPE examination and the spot diagnosis that is asked. This slide, it shows some major complications of the pulmonary embolism. Most of the pulmonary emboli, they are usually clinically silent. They are usually very minute and small, and they do not cause any kind of or any type of the symptom. However, when small pulmonary emboli, when they get organized, only then they can cause one of these complications. So the important complications, they are the heart failure, the right-sided heart failure, which is a very common cause of the death in the pulmonary embolism. Similarly, pulmonary hemorrhage that occurs due to the obstruction of the arteries, and as a result of obstruction of the arteries, it can result in the hemorrhage from the pulmonary vasculature. uh, Third important complication is the pulmonary infarction, because most of the arteries that are present in the pulmonary circulation, they are end arteries. So as a result of infarction of the pulmonary vasculature, these end arteries, they get blocked, and the specific area that is supplied by that specific artery, that is infarcted or that becomes necrotic. And a very important complication of the pulmonary embolus or pulmonary embolism, that is the pulmonary hypertension. And this pulmonary hypertension, it is again it is present, or it is coexistent with the right sided heart failure. The second important form of embolism, that is systemic thromboembolism. And the most of the systemic thromboemboli, they usually arise from the mural thrombi, and these mural thrombi, they can be associated with the infarction of the ventricular wall, or they can be due to the atrial fibrillation. And other causes that may result in the systemic thromboembolism, they may include the aneurysm, which are the dilatation of the aorta or other arteries. It can be due to some atherosclerotic narrowing, or the atherosclerotic plaques which are present in the blood vessels. In the previous lecture, we discussed about the vegetation. So vegetations, they can give rise to the systemic thromboembolism. Similarly, paradoxical emboli, which travel from the venous circulation towards the arterial circulation, that can cause a systemic thromboembolism. So these are a few important factors, or you can say few important conditions which are associated with the development of systemic thromboembolism. When we talk about the common location or the common sites where the systemic thromboembolism, or where these thromboemboli, they get dislodged, they can be in the order of preference. If we talk about them, most of the systemic thromboemboli, they usually dislodge in the lower limbs. So like they can involve the femoral arteries. As a result, lower limbs, they can be involved. Similarly, cerebral circulation, it is also involved to less common extent than the lower limb blood vessel. And they can even get dislodged in the other important organs. For example, intestine is very common tissue that usually is involved by the systemic thromboembolism, especially in the old age people who are known case of some heart disease like myocardial infarction, old ischemia, or who are suffering from some debilitating illness that may result in the decreased mobility. Apart from the intestine, kidney and spleen, they can also be involved by the systemic form of the thromboembolism. The third important category of embolism, that includes the fat and marrow embolism. Usually this fat embolism, it is associated with the fractures of the long bones or trauma to the long bones, especially the long bones of the lower limb. And in the case of fractures of the long bones, microscopic fat globules, they usually get associated with the bone marrow, and both of these tissues, they get dislodged in the blood vessel, and then they are carried to the systemic circulation and ultimately end up in the pulmonary circulation. When the fat and marrow embolism, they end up in the pulmonary circulation, they cause a condition that is called as fat embolism syndrome. And this fat embolism syndrome, it can be quite drastic in few cases. For example, it can lead to death of the patient. The person with the fat embolism syndrome, he or she can present with breathing difficulty, increase in the respiratory rate, there may be tachycardia, the blood pressure may drop down, and ultimately the patient can go into coma. When there is the presence of the fat globules in the blood vessel, it may cause thrombocytopenia because the platelets they get adhere to the fat globules, and ultimately they are cleared from the circulation by the spleen. The spleen it causes the sequestration of these platelets. It also causes sequestration of the red blood cells, so it may result in thrombocytopenia, it may result in the anemia or the hemolysis, and that anemia that is usually associated with this fat and marrow embolism, that is called as the hemolytic anemia, because it is due to clearing or the sequestration of the red blood cells by the spleen. When we talk about the pathogenesis of fat embolism, fat and the marrow embolism, it usually involves both the biochemical injury and the mechanical injury. Fat globules and the associated platelets and the red cells, they can occlude the pulmonary circulation, they can even travel to the brain or the cerebral circulation. So when they travel to the circulation, there occurs the release of fatty acid from these fat globules, and these fatty acids they can further aggravate the condition by causing local toxic injury, and this toxic injury it can also destroy the endothelial cells. So when there is endothelial injury, there is further activation and aggregation of the platelets, and the whole process of the platelet aggregation, the platelet plug formation, that occurs or that starts. Ultimately, this platelet activation, platelet aggregation, and toxic endothelial injury, various types of the enzymes they are released, and ultimately they result in the free radical injury to the blood vessel. So the fat and the marrow embolism, it can become very drastic, and it can ultimately result in the death of the patient as a result of pulmonary dysfunction and as a result of cardiac dysfunctions. The next important form of the embolism is the air embolism. It occurs when the gas bubbles of the air it results in the formation of the frothy masses that can obstruct the blood vessel or the vascular flow and cause the ischemic injury or the ischemic necrosis of some specific organ or some specific tissue or area. About or more than 100 milliliter of gas or the air bubbles, they are usually required to produce the signs and symptoms, especially the signs and symptoms that are related to the pulmonary circulation. Three important terms that are written here and they need special elaboration, and they are the decompression sickness, bends, and the Caisson's disease. If we talk about the decompression sickness, it is usually present in the individuals who experience sudden decrease in the atmospheric pressure. For example, in the deep sea divers, and another very common example is the persons who are present in the unpressurized air cabins. If we take the example of the deep sea divers, they usually breathe at high pressure, and their cylinder it contains oxygen and the nitrogen. When the air that is breathed at high temperature, high pressure, increased amount of the gas, especially the nitrogen, that is dissolved in the blood and the tissue. If the same diver then ascends rapidly to the surface of the water, the nitrogen comes out of the solution in the tissues and the blood, and ultimately causing the signs and symptoms that may affect the pulmonary circulation, and ultimately causing breathlessness and tachypnea, tachycardia, and it can be fatal in few cases. The second important term that is written here is the bends. Bends it refer to the formation of the air bubbles, especially in the connective tissue, especially in the skeletal muscles and around the joints. And when they are formed around the joints, especially, it may result in the formation of a painful condition, and that painful condition is called as bends. A third important term that is written here is Caisson's disease, and this Caisson's disease is due to the gas emboli in the skeletal system, and these gas emboli it may lead to multiple small foci of the ischemic necrosis. The common site, if we talk about the common site of these small foci of the ischemic necrosis, they are the femoral heads, or the head of the femur. Then there comes the tibia, another important bone of the lower limb, and the humerus. So these are the three conditions that need special elaboration. Another important thing to mention here is the chokes. If we talk about the chokes, and if we talk about the lungs, the gas bubble in the pulmonary vasculature, they can cause edema, hemorrhage, and atelectasis, and ultimately resulting in the formation of respiratory distress, and this respiratory distress that is called as chokes. So these three conditions, they need special elaboration: decompression sickness, Bend's and Caisson's disease, and one of them is usually asked with the question of air embolism in the OSPE examination. The next important form of the embolism is amniotic fluid embolism. This amniotic fluid embolism, it is the fifth most common cause of the maternal mortality all over the world. It usually arises as a complication of the labor or immediately in the postpartum period. The incidence of this amniotic fluid embolism, it is not that much high, but once this amniotic fluid embolism it occurs, it carries a very high mortality rate. The specific symptoms of this amniotic fluid embolism, they include severe breathing difficulty followed by cyanosis, especially the cyanosis of the lips and cyanosis of the extremities. Then there occurs some shock-like condition, and due to this shock-like condition, few focal neurological deficits they can be seen, especially the seizures, ultimately resulting in the coma or death of the patient. If the patient she survives the initial attack or the initial period and starts recovering from the coma-like condition, ultimately it will result in development of the pulmonary edema. And this pulmonary edema, it is also associated with the disseminated intravascular coagulation. The important point to note here is that the pulmonary embolism that is associated with the deep venous thrombosis, that carries a low mortality and low morbidity as compared to the amniotic fluid embolism. Why it is so? Because due to amniotic fluid embolism, various biochemical reactions they are started, and these biochemical reaction they cause the activation of the clotting factors, and when the clotting factors they are activated, ultimately the components of the immune systems they are also activated by the amniotic fluid, and these clotting factors and the components of the immune system are initially cause the whole clotting of the blood, but when these coagulation factors they are consumed, ultimately it will result in the bleeding from various sides of the body. So it will end in the form of disseminated intravascular coagulation. This amniotic fluid embolism, it occurs due to infusion of the amniotic fluid or the fetal tissue into the maternal circulation, and this infusion it occurs via some tear or via rupture of the placental membrane or the uterine vessels. If we talk about the findings, the various findings which can be seen, especially at autopsy, the surgeon he may found some hair or desquamated epithelial cells in the blood vessels. There may be some fat tissue that can be seen in the blood vessels or the gastrointestinal tract of the maternal pulmonary circulation. So these are some important findings which can be seen in the autopsy, and usually in our country the autopsy is not performed for the natural causes of the death. In the next slide, I'll show you the microscopic picture of this amniotic fluid embolism. So this is the microscopic features or the microscopic picture of the amniotic fluid embolism. You can see a blood vessel that is encircled by red ink, and this blood vessel, it is choked by the squamous cells. All these laminated structures, they are the squamous cells that are filling the blood vessels. So there are two blood vessels that are seen in this picture, and both of them, they are choked by these squamous epithelial cells or the squamoid cells. Second important feature that is present here is the formation of the edema fluid, and the edema fluid that is highlighted by the yellow highlighter in this case. Note that immediately the areas which are immediately in front of the blood vessels, they contain a huge amount of the edema fluid, while in the other areas you can also see that, as I have pointed out by the highlighter, that the edema fluid that is dispersed in between the cells. So these are the two important features, the microscopic features of the amniotic fluid embolism. One is the presence of these squamide cells, or the laminated squamide laminated structures which are present in the blood vessel, and second is the formation of the edema fluid in between the cells. So this was all about the embolism and its various important forms. The important questions are about the embolism I told you with the passage of the slides. In the next lecture, we'll discuss the next important topic of the hemodynamics. So till then, stay tuned and Allah Hafiz.